So I would be interested in, as I understand it, you were heavily involved with Internews training of journalists and construction of this networks of independent journalists. And so I'd be interested in talking to you about that. And
Okay.
so how you got interested in Russia, how you get pulled into it, and then your experience in that period.
Okay, sure.
Does that work for you?
Yeah, fire away.
Yeah. Okay. So first of all, how'd you get started? How'd you get interested in Russia? Is it a family
Yes.
connection
No,
or?
I mean, very much like you. I'm of, from my family's from the Pale of Settlement, from that turn of the century immigration. So 3/4 of my family are from Russia, or from Ukraine and Poland and that whole area. So
Right.
there was that, but as your family probably indicated, that Russia was more a place to run from than it was a place to run to,
Absolutely. Yeah.
and I'm sure you got a lot of guff from people in your family. Why did you want to go back there?
Yeah. My mother called me when I was going the first time in 1984. She called me up and she said, "Don't get brainwashed."
That's right. That's right. Well, I always I have a good friend named Deborah Javelin, who you might want to talk to too. She's at Notre Dame. She's a Russian person, and I mean, she's Russian studies person that I was with at Brown.
Okay.
But her grandfather, when she told her grandfather, oh, she asked her grandfather, "Why did you leave Russia?" And he said, "Because they was killing everyone." So,
Yeah, one of the people I interviewed told me that his grandfather said, "If you go to Russia, I'll never talk to you again." He went, and the grandfather never talked to him again.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. So
Well,
strong feelings. Yeah.
Strong feelings. Yeah. So nobody gave me that sort of degree of admonition, but so I went to university. I went to Brown University. I matriculated in 1985. So my university career more or less overlapped with Gorbachev.
Uh-huh.
And so, it was kind of an exciting time to look at Russia. And what was interesting is that at Brown, the Russian Studies department just wasn't really ready for Russia to get big. It was this usually, I don't know if you've ever read the novel Panin by Nabokov, but, Panin, have you read the novel?
No, not that one. No.
It's just about a Russian Studies professor at an obscure college and how the Russian Studies department is contained within the German Studies department, and he has a little tiny corner desk while the German has a giant, huge desk. So that was kind of the nature of the Russian Studies department or Soviet Studies department at Brown. But I started studying it because a friend of my brother's had gone to the Norwich the Russian immersion program.
Right.
It sounded kind of exciting and interesting. And also, I grew up in Greenwich, Connecticut, which was about as Republican as you could get. And there was a certain kind of anti-hegemonic thing about studying Russia that appealed to me, I think, at the time.
Uh-huh.
So I did that, and then also at a certain point, with just momentum took over. It turned out that Russian studies was kind of a gut major at Brown, and there were many other things I wanted to do at college. So, before I knew it, I had half the credits I needed to get the major. So I just sort of stuck with it.
Yeah, and you were studying Russian language as well?
I was studying Russian language, but there was an intensive track that was taught by a very famous teacher named Barbara Monahan, who was also colloquially known as Babushka. But I didn't take that. I just took the regular, easy Russian. So I never did any serious Russian immersion. And then I decided I'd always had a pretty strong interest in environmental studies. So I ended up writing, I didn't have to do this, but I ended up doing an honors thesis on the Soviet environmental policy.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So again, my Russian I didn't have very good reading Russian. So I depended mostly on the current digest of the Soviet press. That was Brown had a good archive of that. And I did a undergraduate thesis that was called think it was called Efficiency Planning in the Soviet Environment. It was sort of about how the Soviet bureaucracy was trying to kind of hide behind environmental rules or environmental awareness as a way of cutting bureaucratic fat. And it wasn't that great a thesis, but that's what I did.
Yeah.
So when I graduated, I never had done, at the time, you might remember that the only way to get to Russia in the Soviet Union as a student, there was the CIEE program.
Uh-huh.
And I never applied to that. But by the time 1990 came around, when I graduated, things were really opening up quite a bit. And so there were a lot of different programs that started appearing.
Yeah.
And I applied, and I paid for a program to go to Leningrad for a few months to ostensibly study the Soviet environment. But what I really did is I brought a camera along with me, a high camera, and interviewed different environmentalists with the idea of doing an independent documentary about the Soviet environmental movement.
Oh, okay.
So I interviewed a lot of people. There was a big issue going around about building a dam across the Finnish Gulf, which I think eventually got built.
Right. I just spoke to Liz Haas this morning,
Mm-hmm.
who was also mentioned this same dam.
Yeah, so exactly. And it was, my colleague Maura McDonald, who you might also want to talk to at the Walton Foundation, she and I were both around at the same time, and we both were kind of fascinated with the idea of the way that the environmental movement got used as a way of expressing dissent and also ethnic specificity, let's say, because the Baltic states, the early independence movements there circled around ecological movements. So in Leningrad, I can't remember the name of the guy right now, but there was a guy who led a little bit of a protest group about the dam, and I got to know him a bit. There were other academics there that I met, and I was sort of within some sort of like geophysical department within Elgo at the time. So I did that. For a few months, and then I came home, and then I was invited again to the Soviet Union, this time by something a funny, and this will ring a bell with you, this thing called the Cooperation Project. And it was, it will ring a bell, just the zeitgeist, the zeitgeist of it all.
Right.
It was basically just, an American woman who had fallen in love with a Russian man, and they got a project together. And the idea was to make a documentary about Lake Baikal and the pulp mills that were going up along Lake Baikal.
Right.
So I was invited along as one of the cameramen. There were 2 camera people brought, and we went to Lake Baikal, and we spent a month on Lake Baikal, mostly on a boat, filming different communities about what was going on there. And we actually got caught in the 91 coup, and we were really terrified, and we thought, that we were going to basically never be allowed to leave the country.
Right. What do you mean caught? You were there while it went on?
Yeah. we were in Siberia, in Irkutsk,
right,
when it happened. So, we were actually talking about kind of escaping through Mongolia at the time, because remember, like when the Gukha took power, for a few days, it was true that, all the regular scheduled programming went off the air. There was a lot of Swan Lake.
Right.
And you saw those old drunken men on camera, talking about bringing the old days back, et cetera, et cetera. But within a few days, the coup was over, and we went to Leningrad, and and that was sort of what seemed like the big opening, and everything was going to be great from then on. And then a little bit. Sorry if I'm going a little long on the introduction.
No. That's long is fine. Did this film get made?
Oh, we had hours and hours and hours of footage, and it never came to anything. And if you want, I can put you in touch with the woman who was sort of responsible for trying to get it edited. Is an old friend of mine named Rebecca Dreyfus. Okay. And she's in New York. She probably still has the footage. But I remember it was this, it was a very Russian concept, because like the director, in that very sort of Russian artist way, he wasn't making a documentary, he wasn't making a feature film. It was something entirely new. And
That's so Russian. Yes.
Yeah, but there was something interesting thing about it. One thing that was interesting is that the motif. Do you know the song "Slavnoye Moре Svesheny Baikal"? It's like, "Slavnoye Moре Svesheny
Oh yeah,
Baikal,"
yeah.
and
Okay.
and it's like a soft shoe national anthem of Russian nationalism, but it focuses on Baikal. So we would have these random choruses singing the song in different parts of around Lake Baikal. So it could have been interesting if
Yeah.
we hadn't been so sort of scattershot. So anyway, the film never really came to light. And I was sort of in my 20s and at loose ends, and then I was hired by Whittle Communications. You might recall in the early 90s, there was this effort called Channel One, which was this idea of getting TV into classrooms. This is, pre-internet.
Uh-huh.
And we were doing this series of international high school assemblies where we would link, and this is where the space bridge comes in. We would link an American high school with a different high school in another country, and the pilot one was with Russia. And I was hired, and this is how I met Evelyn. Internews was kind of the producing partner on it on the Russian side, and I was hired to be just kind of a production assistant on that project. And I think Tom Brokaw hosted it, and it was a big success for Whittle. It was done. It was called the program was called Sharing Freedom, and we'd have these audiences of high school kids in the audience, and then we'd select a few of them to be the sort of communicators in the group, and we connected with a high school in Russia. It was a special English school, obviously, because the Americans weren't going to find any Americans who spoke Russian,
right?
Which in a way, really laid the groundwork for the ongoing miscommunication between Russians and Americans, and that there was never really a good faith effort to meet the Russians in their own language. So anyway, so we did that. That show went pretty well, and then eventually Evelyn and Internews circled back to me about a year later because they had started this training program in Russia. They'd done one series of seminars. They got a huge amount of money from USAID, or huge money at the time.
Right.
My predecessor, Molly Allen, had been hired away to produce a feature film, and so they needed somebody to take over the program, and gave me very little lead time. I think I got the email, because remember, email was new, in early September for a project that I had to launch for November.
Whoa. And what year was this?
This was 1992.
92. Yeah. Okay.
So very quickly, like I was 25 years old, I think. I was young, or felt young anyway. I guess nowadays people get going quicker. But I remember David Hoffman. I don't know if have you interviewed David?
Yes, I have. So
David sort of dumped his Rolodex on my desk and said, here, call these people. You could hire them to be trainers. And I remember my mission was to find 3 trainers from America who we'd bring over. And then my colleague Manon Aslamazyan would sort of handle all the Russian logistics. And I would bring my crew over, and then we'd do this whole thing. So the first person I called was actually Sandy Sokolow, who was Walter Cronkite's producer at CBS News. Wow. And Sandy had recently retired, and I called and left a message. And he immediately called me back because he thought I was another Paul Greenberg. There's a Paul Greenberg at the Arkansas Press Democrat who's a Pulitzer Prize winning columnist. He thought I was he. And I said, no, I'm this Paul Greenberg. And he's like, what? And I was like, oh. I said, well, I wanted to take you to the Soviet Union, former Soviet Union. I thought maybe you'd want to come. But anyway, don't forget me. He goes, no, wait a second. Stay on the line. I'll go. So Sandy agreed to go. Uh-huh. And then I hired a few other people. I hired a couple of journalists, and I hired a cameraman editor to come. And then we went to these 3 cities in the former Soviet Union. We went to Kiev, we went to Volgograd, and we went to Samara, formerly Kuylashev. Uh-huh. But it was very slipshod and difficult. At the time, there was no jet fuel. So our flights kept getting canceled,
Uh-huh.
and so
Like
we
from
often
the
ended up.
U.S.?
No, the U.S. was fine. Is the internal Aeroflot flights that
Okay.
kept getting canceled.
The
So
domestic.
like, so we did our first seminar in Kiev, and then we couldn't fly from Kiev to Moscow to get to Volgograd. So we ended up we bribed an in-tourist bus that was just a local tour bus to
Yeah.
drive all the way to Moscow on this shitty road. And I remember I said to Manana, my colleague, so what are we to do when we get to the border? She's like, there's no border. It's Ukraine and Russia. There's one country. And I was like, I think there's a border now. and we got to the border, and the border was a GAI post
Right.
that in normal times would have just been like a highway post, but it was a border now. And we got to the border. I always remember the people at the border were like, what do we do? Nobody knew what to do. And then Manana said, how about we make coffee? And we had a nice coffee machine and nice coffee. And we went in the GAI post and we just made coffee. And that was the border crossing.
And that was the border crossing. Yeah. Yeah.
So anyway, so that was that. And then, it happened again. The flights kept getting canceled. The other funny thing that happened was that when we went from Volgograd to Samara, like Manana was convinced we were going to be able to get a flight. I knew we weren't going to. And at the last minute, of course, we couldn't. And we ended up renting an Icarus bus, which was even shittier than the in-tourist bus. It was super, super uncomfortable. It was a 12-hour drive. And we were so uncomfortable. In the middle of the night, we were passing through, what was the name of it? It was a town in between Volgograd and Samara, I think Saratov. And in the distance, I saw this huge illuminated sign that said Podushki, pillows, and it was a pillow factory.
Wow.
And I was like, what is, and weirdly, like in that Soviet way, it was open in the night. And we rushed in, and for a few bucks, Manana bought like 30 pillows, and we covered the entire Icarus bus with pillows, and we all slept on it. And meanwhile, in Samara, they're waiting for the great American journalists to arrive.
Right.
And of course, they were shitty Soviet pillows, and they exploded, and we were all covered in feathers, so that when the door opened to the Icarus bus and the American journalists marched out, we had literally been, feathered, not no tar, but feathered. And then we did the whole thing.
Fantastic.
So yeah. So anyway, things improved from there. Like I did a number of these kind of seminars. The original concept of the seminar was kind of based on Alexei Kirillovich Simonov's idea, was that the center was always going to re-exert dominance over the provinces unless you empowered the provinces, and that you needed to develop an exterior network of communication that didn't go through Moscow.
Who is he? Who is this person?
Alexei Kirillovich Simonov was the son of the famous Simonov, who was one of the famous Russian radio presenters during the Second World War. But Alexei Kirillovich founded this thing called the Fond Защиты Гласности.
Okay.
And he was just, he's a dissident. Well, not dissident, but he was a real Russian Democrat of that era. And
right.
He could, and unlike I think a lot of us, he could see the brewing retraction that was coming. Were we not to seize this moment? And Alex, go ahead.
And he was involved with Internews?
Well, he was like kind of an advisor. Manana, our administrator, and who eventually became head of Internews Russia, she was Alexei Kirillovich's sort of number 2 at the fund. Okay. And then David hired Manana away from, like, basically he used to joke, I think, that he bought Manana from Alexei Kirillovich for a computer, a bunch of computers. I can't remember. But Manana clearly liked the job, and she was really the heart of the Internews Russia operation. She's like a long, real Russian or Soviet intellectual. She's Armenian by birth and by heritage. She speaks Armenian, but she was the administrator of the Malibroni Theater under a very famous director. So she was very artistically inclined and stuff, but he was also extremely capable, big talker, kind of person who just made things like the logistician that any Russian operation needed to happen. So anyway, so through Manana, with her acting as the sort of fulcrum, we then launched a series of programs that were these local journalism seminars that we would do. I did several of them. We also did management seminars. We started to elaborate on them and do advertising seminars, different things like that. And they all took their different forms. I was, go ahead.
Who came to them?
From the Russian side?
Yeah.
So at the time, there were several hundred, quote unquote, independent television stations. And
Okay.
they had all appeared, and again, I'm not the most expert on this. There are a couple of people I can send you to who can give you the sort of technical background. But as far as I understood, after the fall of the Soviet Union, there was a liberalization of the broadcast laws, which suddenly allowed you to either buy time on a transmitter or even build your own transmitter. And I think that there probably was some kind of public auction of local frequencies.
Right.
So these different stations came about through different means. Some of them started as little cable operations in apartment complexes. Like basically, if you could hook up your VCR to the communal antenna of a large apartment complex, Russians who are always, as you know, very technically minded, they figured out a way to get to, allow or disallow subscribers onto their network. So the truly independent television stations that I knew started as these kind of micro cable operations.
Right.
And then they got enough money to go on to the next level. But then there were these kind of quasi, I think they were called RTCP, Regionalny Telewizjony Centralny, whatever broadcasting is. I can't remember. But anyway, so everyone was, it's like everyone was claiming to be independent and democratic, right?
Okay.
So sometimes you'd have a truly independently minded thing that grew out of a cable operation, or maybe somebody cobbled some money together to buy a frequency or rent a frequency. But then there were these regional parts of the state broadcasting network that were kind of trying to break away, not necessarily for ideological purposes, but because everything was being privatized and everyone was sort of reaching out for their sort of slice of the pie.
Right.
So, the person who was really under the gun was Manon Aslamazyan, because she was the one choosing the participants and contacting the stations and getting everyone to be sent there. And the idea was to get 12 or so journalists to each seminar, and we would purposefully mix them up. So like if a cameraman and a journalist arrived from, say, Aktubinsk, we would break them up and pair them with different people, because the idea was to get them outside of their little insular.
It must have been a trip with Russians who don't like strangers. So yeah.
No, exactly. Yeah. And it was that was difficult. And then what we would do, so those would be the people that would come, and we would create a little newsroom for the week where they would have to produce. Everyone would have to produce a 2 or 3 minute news story, and then we would put it all together into a TV show at the end of the week.
And so it was a technical production, but also business training as well.
There were two flavors. Like it's not really technical; it was really more journalistic. Like the idea was to really train them in the fundamentals of objective reporting. And that's what the journalistic side of things. The management seminars, those are completely different. And with the management seminars, we would do a similar kind of thing where I'd bring some Americans over, and we'd bring them to Moscow. We'd bring the television station managers to Moscow, and then we'd do like a 5-day, 3 or 4 day workshop on the fundamentals of local television broadcasting.
Right. But so the meta overview was to strengthen regional TV that wasn't subsumed by Moscow.
Right. And then there was this other element, which my colleague Vince Malmgren really was in charge of, who you could speak to too. But Vince was in charge of the Moscow office, and he was one really in charge of. So there's this program called Vremya Местное, and that was really the essence of it. Because, like, remember back in the day, I don't think they still do this, but it was like, you could be anywhere. You could be in Petropavlovsk-Kamchatka, and you'd hear boop, 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 Moskovskoye время 12 часов. And you're like, well, why do I need to know what time it is in Moscow when I'm 9 time zones away?
Right.
So Vremya Местное was the idea that that was the name of the news exchange. And the idea is that we were going to emphasize local news, local perspectives. But what you ended up getting was and so the idea is, in a theoretical concept, the idea is we were going to train all these stations to do local news. And then they were going to do a news exchange, having been trained. And then we were going to disseminate that news exchange amongst all the TV stations.
I see. Okay.
So it'd be like this provincial.
And you were going to have content that you produced independently of reporting on all different parts of the country that various stations could use as they chose.
Well, yeah, and the stations themselves would be producing it. In other words, so like if you were in Sverdlovsk or whatever it's called, Ekaterinburg, you'd throw 4 minutes into it, and Tomsk would throw 4 minutes into it, and Krasnoyarsk would throw 4 minutes into it, and altogether you would get what I think the Russians call a kapusta, like it was just sort of a salad thrown together. And that was part of the problem, is that the program never really had an organizing principle. But I always remember that the more like liberal Muscovites that watched the show liked that, that it was kind of, even though it was imperfect, the fact that it was made independent of, I remember a Russian friend of mine described it as a little bit like a buffet. Like, oh, I think I'll have some carrots, and I'll have some beans.
Right.
So it was, but, at the same time, there was always this very deep Muscovite prejudice against the provinces that even Manana had shared. Even though she herself was from Yerevan, she had a Muscovite perspective on things and always found it to be, she recognized the importance of it, but she also, it was like they were like children.
Yeah. Okay. And what channel did this appear on?
It would literally at first the news exchange arrived on cassette by a train, and then we would edit it and mix it in Moscow and then send it back out to them, and then they would just put it up on their channel. They would put it up on their local channel.
On their local channel.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. There wasn't a national channel. There was no national network in the sense of a national channel.
Well, so there was this thing that they tried to get together called NDS, and I think it was Независимый. I think it was called NDS, but that was the goal, was to try and get an independent network going, and that the news exchange would be the sort of first baby steps towards that, and eventually there were moves towards making the network a real network. And I believe a guy named Andrei Vdovin was the first chair of NDS. But everywhere you went, the problem was everywhere you went, everyone wanted to be the center. Like every station I went to, they'd be like, no, if you look at the map, Tomsk is clearly the center, and all the other radios. If you look at the map, Ekaterinburg is clearly the center, and so everyone was trying to be that. But they did make some progress, and there were some genuinely sort of interesting, enlightened people that saw it as having some potential. The biggest problem came when, USAID in their own kind of Soviet way was trying to kind of, from the top down, impose this idea of capitalism. So like how is this thing that we were doing going to be self-sustaining? And so the way that I frankly didn't know anything about the television business. I had taken some filmmaking courses at Brown and stuff like that, but like I didn't know anything about the weird way that TV works, or worked at that time. But we eventually got involved in what we realized is that most of the TV stations what they really needed was programming. What they really wanted was licensed programming.
Yeah.
But none of them could afford that. So it turned out that there's this whole scheme of acquiring programming where you can basically, if you have somebody who pre-sells the content, like say, to use a very popular example of the time, say TV2 in Tomsk would like to show Baywatch.
Okay.
So they can't afford Baywatch. But what they can provide is an audience of 500,000 people that would also like to watch Baywatch. So what they can do is you can buy the programming, but leave advertising holes in it, so that then the dealer in Europe or America can then slap in, go and shop the programming around. Say, look, I got 500,000 people in Tomsk who want to watch this program. Do you want to sell them Snickers? So I said, of course. So then they would go sell the Snickers, and then so that it was still profitable. It's funny, all these old Russian pribylna, right?
Right.
They would leave. There would be a few holes left for TV2 in Tomsk to put in their local advertising. So, and if you want to talk about this in more in detail, my colleague Rebecca Dreyfus, who I went to by call with, but who I later brought in. Well, I didn't really bring in. I said, somebody could make some money off of this, and she came in and did make some money off of this. She started a business, and I can't remember what the name of the business was, but she started a business where she literally did that, brought programming in, and did all that. So,
So AID's goal was a self-sustaining business of independent stations. It wasn't any particular interest in content of how news was covered or.
No, I disagree there. No, I mean, first and foremost, it was part of a democratization initiative.
Okay.
And I think, whether they were acting on their own internal initiative or, David Hoffman was a very good salesman of the concept.
Yeah.
And his idea, what he had been led to believe and what he pushed in the halls of Congress was that, the engine of democracy is independent media. And that, and in particular, local news. What AID really wanted was local news. They wanted people doing investigative reporting on a local level, bringing people the truth, on a local level. But what we quickly learned as people regularly in contact with these local TV stations was that it's all well and good to want to do news, but if you can't afford to run your station,
right,
then what's the point of it? So it was kind of trying to balance financial infrastructure with news infrastructure. I mean, just to give an example, there was this TV station in Krasnoyarsk called Afontovo. And Afontovo, we really liked the TV station manager, Sasha Karpov, be a great guy to interview, actually, if you want. He's in Spain now. Sasha, he really was one of our early students. He loved the idea of doing independent news. So he somehow got investment from the local aluminum factory, and he built up this whole extensive news team, like news team Krasnoyarsk, and it was like graphics and American style. And meanwhile, as he's getting his news team ready, he was putting on the air reruns of this Mexican soap opera called Bogate Tojo Plaket. Remember this one?
I know this one. I've seen it. Yes.
The rich also cry.
Yes.
So Bogate Tojo Plaket was on every day while News Center 2, Afontovo, was getting ready.
Yeah.
And then, so finally, News Center 2, Afontovo, was ready to launch. And they launched it, And the old ladies who had become addicted to Bogate Tojo Plaket stormed the television station demanding that The Rich Also Cry be reinstalled as soon as possible.
In prime time. Right.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So, I think, by that point, remember, this is 92, so Glasnost had already been going on for quite some time. You already saw a certain exhaustion with democracy and, that phrase, "My nie zaнимаем się polityką," nas nie interesuje się polityka. That kind of undercurrent was already there. And we're like, no, it's not politics, it's news. And news, it's politics. So the idea that there could be an objective news exclusive to politics really never fully took root. It was always like, who's really paying for this? Why are you doing this? Et cetera, et cetera.
Right.
But, to my mind, the infrastructure, it was sort of like, building a railroad. It's like we cut down the trees in a good way, or let's say like we put the hole through the mountain
Yeah.
to make the tunnel.
Right.
We laid down a couple of rails. We drove an occasional train through that tunnel, and it kind of worked. You
Uh-huh.
know, my colleague Vince will probably say he might not agree, but from my perspective, I thought it was interesting. I thought that some progress was being made, but I think, and this is where a certain deafness to the Russian idiom affected the program's effectiveness. Just because I think, well, actually, I don't know. I mean, I think we did an okay job. Like, I tried to find Russian-speaking trainers when I could, and
Yeah.
increasingly we tried to do this effort of like training the trainers so that we'd have Russians doing the work.
Right.
I think, given a few more years, like I always remember, when was it, in 2002, 2003, there was a huge jubilee for Internews. I think it was like it must have been 10 years of Internews Moscow,
Right.
and it was a vast venue, like it was some sort of opera house or something. But there were hundreds and hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands, of people there. It was like, it was very like celebratory. Like, look, we've got 300 stations from coast to coast to whatever, from border to border.
Right.
It's growing. It's profitable to some degree. It's getting profitable. Some of the TV station managers that we knew were making real money, to the point where I remember Evelyn saying, "What are we still supporting these people for? They're making more money than we are." So yeah, and then that's when when does Putin come in? What year?
2000.
2000. So this was just the beginning. It was before the screws got put on Putin.
Right. So what was your understanding of independent? What did independent mean?
Yeah, that's a good question. If we'd had the resources to do like a thorough audit, then we would have cast a much narrower net, I think. AID was big on numbers. And did you do any work with AID over the years?
No, I never did.
AID was always interested in like benchmarks, and I always remember we were always saying over 300 stations, and my colleague Anthony Garrett always remembers that I used to say like this thing of like, objective journalism is composed of independently gathered facts. You're trained. So like thousands of people trained, so there was a pressure to rack up numbers, I think, rather than kind of vet and make sure that we were getting the right people. But that said, and also there was a complicated political dance going on that Manana was doing that I wasn't even really, like, when Manana would get on the phone and start speaking rapidly in Russian, and I knew she was talking some nonsense to some station, I was like, oh, whatever. I don't even know what's going on. I don't want to know. And so, there was a certain kind of local appeasement. Like, I always remember there was this guy in Samara. The station was clearly one of these artsetsepes that was part of the state system that was, trying to be independent, but was clearly. And I always remember, I can't remember. It was like, wish I could. Nikolai Panteleevich was the head of the station, and he was like this classic Soviet bureaucrat, like white hair and da. And he was so impressed with Sandy Sokolow, that he'd come. He was Walker Cronkite's producer, and I remember we had this blowout banquet where he gave Sandy this bottle of brandy that literally was 4 feet tall. Like, it was just vast, and then Sandy shocked him by opening it and starting to pour, like, because Nikolai Panteleevich had this fantasy that Sandy was going to bring this 4-ton bottle back to New York, and then it would sit on his shelf but he poured it out, and then anyway, just that kind of thing. So, and I also remember we were there for Thanksgiving, and Manana was panicking that the Americans were going to not have turkey at their Thanksgiving, and Nikolai Panteleyevich made the turkeys appear out of nowhere.
Uh-huh.
And and we had a whole Thanksgiving thing.
Right,
there.
right. Well, part of the reason I'm asking you about this independence is that, and I think it was in Koch's memoirs that I was reading. I was starting to read some of the memoirs of the reformers, and they talked about how the early oligarchs, and here Berezovsky and Guzinski, used the media, their control of the media, for political means to help set the stage for their acquisitions of real assets. That and it would seem to me that locally there were people who were emerging in all these different regions with money, how they got it, whatever, but that the media might have been a place for them to also have a say. And
it's funny because there were different flavors, right? Like, so Afontova, as I told you, in Krasnoyarsk, they had the backing of a major aluminum factory,
right,
and they were always sort of in the background. And I was always trying to, I was a young person myself, so I didn't really actually even know the way the American media worked. But
right,
at a certain point, in the American media, there's lots of money sloshing around of various oligarchs, if you will, controlling things. And so, to some degree, I saw the role of the independent television station manager as a kind of balancing act, trying, in an
public
ideal
service kind of thing. Yeah.
Well, in an American newsroom, let's say pre the horrible consolidation that's happened in the recent years, the idea is that there'd be a business office and there'd be a news office, and the idea is they wouldn't overlap. They would have separate entities and they would do their own thing, because this idea of independent news was enshrined in American consciousness. And we were trying to kind of get that kind of thing going. But because capitalism itself was, it's not that it was new, it's just that the borders of it were hazy. And the idea of it flowing into influencing the news department, I mean, they would give lip service to that when we would talk to the station managers about that. But realistically, was that really possible? I mean, I always used to use the example, like, you could send one of these young reporters out for a story, but she'd go out into the field and she might come back with a story, or she might come back with an advertisement for a tire manufacturer, or she might actually come back with tires. It's like, it was just like, and that was the thing of, you couldn't just put this exoskeleton of capitalism on this very wounded place and expect things to fall in line according to how we hoped that they would fall in line. There was really much more of a basic, the problem is that while these ideas were being sort of spread around everywhere, there was also the people who were really truly wily, the Russian gangsters, the mafia, all these kinds of things. They knew how to make a deal, and they knew how to make a deal much better than a sort of person who would have been tagged an honest businessman. So they just beat those people to the table, and because there weren't very much in the way of rules and a very much of a kind of might is right, way of doing things. I think that what would have been truly independent never got quite a chance to take root.
Right.
I mean, is that your sense?
Yeah, and that being independent, if it meant exposing that local mafia guy, was a hazard. You weren't going to do that. If you had any brains, you weren't going to do that.
Yeah, and we did have a couple of very, it's a personality type, right? Like, there are people who are ready to do that kind of work, and they will do it. And we did have a couple of people. There was a guy named Inokenti Sheremet who at the Greenberg station, who was a really hard-nosed reporter. And there's just a couple of people out there, you just recognize them. It's like the International Society of Investigative Journalists. Like, oh, this guy is not afraid.
Yeah.
It's not. We'll get into all sorts of shit. Probably get killed in the end.
Yeah.
But they existed, and they wanted to do that kind of thing.
Right. right. But also at those days, the regional governors were the real centers of political power.
Yeah.
It must have been very hard to go against them.
I
So,
think I think so, and and resources were thin on the ground. It's funny. I always remember this is a very common advertisement that you would see on local television stations. It would just be this camera panning over stacks of various goods, like a pile of Snickers bars and a pile of pens and a pile of electronics, and then a telephone number would flash on the screen,
uh-huh,
and that was the advertisement.
right,
And I
right,
was like, what is that? And I guess what it was just people through Turkey or wherever got a bunch of shit into the country, and then we're just trying to move it fast. And they used local television as a way of moving it.
right, right, right. And so these local stations were kind of, and they were looking to you to professionalize their operations.
Yes.
Yeah, so that they would
Yeah.
be more competitive, right? Or why?
Yeah. I mean, there were, the flavors varied. There were people who were true Democrats.
Yeah,
And among them, I would consider Sasha Karpov from Krasnoyarsk and a guy named Arkady Mayofis from TV2 in Tomsk, both of whom have emigrated. But they were two younger, truly democratic people who saw the idea of democracy in their hearts and were trying to build a business around that. So there were those.
right.
There was the flavor of really the small timer cable guy who didn't really have much ambitions other than trying to make a buck.
Yeah,
And then there was, as I say, the fragments of the Soviet broadcasting system seeing chaos and anarchy and trying to shore up what they had and
right,
figure out and jockey for position, and really didn't have any strong desire for any kind of political thing. They just wanted to survive to some
right,
degree, but survive and live well.
right. So 1993
Mm-hmm.
and Yeltsin standoff with the parliament and the shelling of the White House. Were you physically in Russia then?
I think I was in Kiev coming back to Moscow. I think I was on a train overnight at the time.
Okay. And how, as a media organization, did you respond to that, or how did you respond to it in terms of how you saw maybe the future of your work in Russia?
It Others might recall it differently. It didn't seem as astoundingly important as it did from the American side.
Uh-huh.
It just seemed like more chaos. That was Khasbolatov, right?
Yeah, right. And Rutskoy. And
And
Rutskoy.
Rutskoy. Yeah, it just seemed, it was like the revanchement, voice rearing its head. It seemed like, it's interesting looking at it from this angle now, where everything seems to be headed more and more in the direction of dictatorship and autocracy. But at the time, the world really seemed like it was opening up for democracy, and
Uh-huh.
so that just seemed like one step back, two steps forward. From
Uh-huh.
technically how we organized everything, I am not quite the person to ask. Are you going to talk? So I don't know if she'd be willing to do it, but again, Manana Aslamazyan, who's in Moscow now.
So how long did your training program go on?
It was ongoing until Internews Moscow got shut down. So I left Internews in 1988. I stopped doing Russia stuff.
1998.
Yeah, well, I'm trying to think actually. When did I leave Russia proper?
Before the ruble collapse?
Yeah, so I stopped doing Russia. I switched over from Russia stuff to Yugoslavia stuff in 1996. So I was doing Yugoslavia stuff from Paris from 96 to 98. And then I gave my job to a woman who sadly passed away a few years ago named Persephone Miel.
Uh-huh.
And they kept going, and I can't remember when Internews Moscow got shut down, but I want to say it was like
I
04,
think
05.
it was right around Hordakovsky's arrest. Shortly,
Yeah, right. Because Khodorkovsky actually did a little bit of work with Internews.
apparently it gave $1 million.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
That's right. Yep.
So, so they were implicated with of being too much independence.
Yeah, yeah. Well, or whatever,
Yeah.
I mean, it was, it's like, it was oligarchs fighting for who was going to run the show. And,
Right. Right.
You want to call that democracy? You could if you'd like, but.
Yeah. Well, I don't know. I mean, I want to stay away from the big labels. I really, one of the people I talked to said that, mostly people don't get it right as to how history really happens. And there's a lot of little things that add up as part of a wave or a general tendency that gets focused around a particular person and I think there's a lot to that.
Yeah. Well, something. What I will say about Internews is that I think that we made a good faith effort to meet the Russians with an attempt to understand their culture and their challenge and their particular local challenges. We always worked with local partners. I thought, in that sense, I think that we were amongst the better of the things out there. But the couple of times that I made flubs as a coordinator of all this really stuck with me. I always remember the very first management seminar that I did. One of the people I hired was great, and the rest of the people I hired were terrible. And it was mostly just me flapping around as a 20-something trying to round up good people and not finding the right match. But I remember there was this guy that I hired from WPIX in New York to talk about. He was an accountant. He was like a business manager to come teach this, this seminar. And so somebody asked him a question and said, "How do I know if an investment is a sound investment?" And this guy said, "Oh, I asked my accountant." And it's like,
Right.
And there was a certain, because of, I think, the ideology that most Americans carried around in their heads about Soviets, there was always a condescension towards them. And it was always Americans coming to Russia saw the pathetic infrastructure that was there in the darkest times of the post-Soviet Union, and they just sort of laughed and thought, "Geez, these are the people that we were afraid of for so many years." Right. And isn't it amusing that it turns out that they're a bunch of yokels and quacks who don't really know what's going on? And this, grated tremendously against the Russians, even though, publicly in their common interactions, they would, of course, never, they were always very polite with the American trainers and stuff like that. So it was hard. And I think if I were to do it again, what I'd say is that you would almost need like a year's training of Americans before they got sent over. Like they should have gone into intense language instruction so that they could truly be fluent. That there needed to be a really deep understanding from Russian instructors telling them what were the underlying political conditions. Because generally speaking, there was just too much assuming going on. And it kind of almost like not really thinking of the Russian reality as a reality. It's just like, just a bunch of nonsense, blah, blah, blah going on, when really there was a lot going on and it was really complicated and hard.
Yeah. Huh. And do you think, what was AID's role in that? Were they culturally kind of deaf and dumb as well?
I mean, they had a couple of people who spoke some Russian. I mean, they had people they had experts. They were not completely deaf and dumb. But I remember there being particular tension around, like, they wanted to do elections training,
Yeah.
like how to cover elections and how to form political parties and things like that. And that to me seemed to me something of a fool's errand, because if you're going to have a political sensibility, it's got to kind of come out of, it's got to be homegrown to some degree.
Right. Yeah.
And it seemed a little bit like the tail wagging the dog. I was trying to think, there was an anecdote I was about to tell you. Think a second. Yeah, I guess it's gone. But yeah, I mean, and there was also always this idea that, I remember what I tell you. Do you know, like, one thing that always like really rankled me, which to me totally encapsulated the whole problem with the whole situation, was that, do you remember, have you been talking to people at the NDI and IRI? Do you know what those are?
No.
So there was this nonprofit, there were two nonprofits. One was called the National Democratic Institute.
Oh, okay. I know what they are, right?
Yeah. And it was so stupid because they were both, their missions were supposedly the same, but one was Republican and one was Democrat.
Right.
And it's so stupid because, like, why do you need two organizations doing the same thing? It's not like, I mean, in an ideal world, like, they shouldn't have different ideas of what democracy is.
Right.
And in fact, the IRI people and the NDI people in Moscow, they'd go to the same bars and hang out and stuff like that. It wasn't like there was a huge ideological divide between them.
Right.
But that to me was just symbolic of the pork and silliness of some of the decisions that AID made. I think overall what was lacking was a sense of urgency, like that people didn't realize what a small window we had. Like it just seemed like it was going to endlessly, expand, when really, do you watch The Bureau? Le Bureau. Have you seen the TV show Le Bureau, the French show? Mm-hmm. Oh, it's really, really worth watching, especially the later seasons that take place in Russia, but it's about the French intelligence service. And there's a whole section in Moscow that flashes back to your time period here.
And it's called The Bureau?
Le Bureau, yeah. And particularly season 5 has a great flashback to an auction of Soviet companies,
right,
in 1994 that really captures the mood of that moment. But yeah, I mean, what you get from that show, and I think looking back on it, is that the only institution of the only contiguous institution that lasted from the Soviet period to the post-Soviet period was the intelligence service.
Yeah.
Which contained and maintained a super high degree of organization and discipline. And meanwhile, the Democrats, were so, diverse and diffuse that they were just, who knew? I mean, again, retrospectively, they're sitting ducks for, what was one of the most powerful intelligence service in the world.
Right.
And of course, unless that was going to be taken on, they were going to win.
Yeah. Yeah. Huh.
Especially since there was, an interrelationship between the intelligence services and the mafia.
Right. But that was not something that was obvious to you at the time.
No, but it was interesting to see how quickly they moved on the Internews Moscow office. But again, as an American, I may not have been privy to that. I might not have heard. Like, there are certain kind of I consider myself pretty, much more culturally sensitive than the average American, but nowhere near sensitive enough to understand the signals. And it's like, I always remember, like, there was once we had to our office a group of dissidents, like old school dissidents, like, this, like, the kind of that came over in the 70s from Russia to America. And they just, like, these guys, they just seem like so, like, tired and old and just, like, smoking papyrosi and, just like, and, and it just, the sight of those people just turned my stomach. But meanwhile, those were actually the true Democrats. You know what I mean? Uh-huh. But the people that appealed to the average American were these young, polished, new-seeming people that quite often were the much more compromised and less democratic. Like Americans were very won over by aesthetics.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
And
Uh-huh.
if you looked smooth and you could speak passable English and stuff, you got through the filter in a way that probably wasn't the right filter.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
Because what you really needed was balls to the walls, fuck you, Soviet power people
Yeah.
who had the backbone and the will to stand up to it. Of course, those were very difficult people to work with, but those were the people that would have been prepared to defend a democratic situation. Like Alexei Kirillovich Simonov, I found to be a very difficult man. Like, every time he saw me, he blew papyrosi smoke in my face. He always questioned and challenged me on everything I said. And I didn't really like hanging out with him, but he was, he's the kind of guy we needed.
Yeah. 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 Interesting. And did you hang out with the expat community while you were there, or were you,
A little bit. It was pretty insular. Like I should also full caveat. Like I would spend a couple of months at a time there. Like
Yeah.
at most. I wasn't like a full-time Moscow resident.
Right.
My colleague Vince was much more like that. But yeah, when I was there, the Internews people, we would hang out a bit. I didn't go to like big. Frankly, I was often on the road when I would come to Russia. Like, so
Right.
I'd be in Kazakhstan or Georgia. I spent a lot of time in things like that.
Uh-huh. 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 So you weren't part of that expat sort of community life, exactly.
Not so much.
Yeah. So were you aware of what the other aid programs were? Because, and how they approached things?
Sometimes, AID sometimes would call groups of contractors together, and we'd have like, a security briefing. Like not like intelligence briefing, but like
Right.
how to keep safe in Moscow. And so we'd see those people, and of course, I always feel like there was a certain. I continue to have friends who we're all kind of like, show me your tattoo. Like, there's a certain kind of veteran of those days that I'm sure you have as well. Like
Right.
you see those people, where they're from and what those days were like.
Yeah.
And it was a unique experience. I should say also there is a book you might find useful that I contributed to called Wild East, the stories from the last frontier. Do you know that book?
I have it. Yeah.
Yeah. So, like there was an expat phenomenon. There was, people called it sort of the second lost generation. And I'm sort of more in contact with those kind of people now,
Uh-huh.
like authors like Arthur Phillips and Gary Steingart to some degree. Well, Gary's more like, Russian.
Yeah. I actually like his books, but there's an absurdity in there that
Yeah, sure.
just captures what you've seen, and if you haven't ever seen it, it sounds like exaggeration, but
Yeah, no, it was a pretty absurd time.
yeah. So okay.
A random anecdote that I feel like I should tell you. I remember once being at a dinner party with a bunch of local TV station people at somebody's mother's house, and we were all eating and drinking and so forth. And there had been one cutlet left on the plate,
Yeah.
and all of a sudden it was gone. And somebody said, like, who took the last cutlet? And this young reporter said, "Privatizirovala." I privatized it. With a certain irony,
Yeah.
Because that was the thing also about the Times, is that privatization and stuff. It was also deeply countercurrent, not just to people's experience, but also just culturally. I think if you'd exposed this kind of raw capitalism to pre-revolutionary Russia, most Russians would have found it distasteful.
Yeah.
I think there's something in the Russian psyche that is communal, that is sharing, that doesn't like this kind of, steal, the inherent theft contained within capitalism. I think by now people are used to it in Russia, but at the time it was definitely a shock, a cultural shock.
Have I covered everything?
I think so. Yeah. I mean, I think the only other thing that's true of that generation of local TV station people is that there were a lot of what they called enthusiasti, people who were not necessarily getting a salary from doing what they were doing, but
Right.
they were very excited to be doing what they were doing.
Right.
And if we think back to who we disappointed the most, it would be those people.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh. And how do you mean disappointed? I mean, you think that they lost their independence or they lost their potential because of us?
Well, not because of Internews, but I think you've heard the word democratia, right?
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
know, I think that there was a lot of dirty capitalism that went on.
Yeah.
That some of it which was seeded by AID unwittingly, I think largely,
Yeah.
but it was like again, you don't know if it was perhaps an insurmountable obstacle having the intelligence operatives against this thing from the beginning,
Yeah.
but there was, I guess maybe. I mean, I don't know how things could have gone differently, but I think um, a little more wisdom, a little more strategic investment, a little less prodding to just privatize everything,
Right.
you know, um, could have won over a few more hearts and minds.